All right, so we're going to take this hook way further, and I just want to preface this by saying if the stuff that we're going to do here is a little over your head, don't worry about it. I promise that this stuff will click later. I just want to show you this to give you an example of what a more complicated hook could be like and how awesome it is that we can put this complicated logic inside of this hook and it doesn't complicate the way that we use it at all. So just keep that in mind. I promise you that this will click eventually if it doesn't click right now. So right now, our use local storage state is assuming that the key and the value are going to be referencing a thing that can be serialized into local storage as a string. And that works out nice for us because the value that we're actually storing is a string. But if that value is a number, then that value is going to get coerced into a string when we set that item into local storage. And then when we try to get it out, it's going to be a string as well. So we need to somehow parse this out and serialize it, stringify it maybe using JSON stringify. So what I'm going to start out with is when we set the item, rather than just simply setting it to that state, I want to serialize it using JSON stringify. So we're going to say JSON stringify that state. And so now when I come around here, I'm going to say hello, and you'll see that it's in quotes. Now, and if I refresh, I'm going to see it in quotes. So we don't want it to be in quotes as it is here. I'm going to go ahead and clear that, and we're going to fix that problem here by doing a JSON parse. So let's get a value in local storage from that window local storage get item. And if there is a value in local storage, then we'll return a JSON parse version of that value in local storage. Otherwise, we'll return the default value as we were before. Okay, sweet. So now I can type in here, I can say George, I can refresh, and it's going to parse that out as George. Perfect. Let's take this a step further. So what if the user of this hook didn't want to use JSON stringify and JSON parse, and they wanted to serialize and deserialize this a different way themselves? So that's actually pretty straightforward to accomplish with some options here. And if they don't want to provide options, then we'll default that to an empty object, and we'll destructure that right in line here, and we'll say serialize is defaulted to JSON stringify, and deserialize is JSON parse. So now they can override those options, but they don't have to. They can do pretty much whatever they want to for serialize and deserialize. So now we can replace JSON parse with deserialize, and we'll use whatever they pass to us. And we'll do JSON stringify will be simply serialize. And now we're going to get a warning right here saying, hey, you need to include serialize as part of your dependencies. So we'll just put that in there. And the reason that's important is because if the serialize function itself changes, then that means we probably need to reserialize it again and save that into local storage, because if the serialize function changed, then the value that we're setting into local storage probably changed as well. So let's go ahead and save this. We get rid of that warning. Things are still working. Awesome. We refresh, we get that still working. Perfect. So the next thing that I want to add here is, what if the default value that they want to provide to me is computationally expensive for them to create? So maybe their initial name here is some sort of like calculate numbers to pi or something really weird like that. If it's computationally expensive, then I don't want to have them have to pass that every single time. And so we're going to do basically the same thing that useState does, and that is make the default value optionally a function. So we can say if the type of default value is a function, then we'll call default value. Otherwise, we'll just return the default value. Cool. All right. Great. So now we're supporting that use case. And then what happens if the key changes on us? So if they decide, hey, I was saving this in the name, but now I'm going to switch and I'm going to save it in some other key, like dunder name or whatever we want to save that as. So this is where things get a little bit more tricky. And what we need to do is we want to remove the old value from the previous key and set the new one. And so to keep track of that previous value, what I'm going to do is have a prev key ref. And that'll be React use ref, and we'll pass as the initial value the key. Okay, and so what this is going to do is this gives me an object that I can mutate without triggering re-renders. And that differs from useState because if I wanted to change this value, then I have to call setState to make a change to that value. and that'll trigger a re-render. But for this particular thing, I don't want to trigger a re-render if I want to change that previous key. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to say, I'm going to get my previous key, and that's going to be the previous key ref.current. And so on the first render, that previous key ref.current is going to be whatever that key was. And then I can say if the previous key is not equal to the current key, that may or may not have triggered this use effect to get recalled. So if those things have changed, then I'm going to say, hey, window local storage, I want to remove the item previous key. So let's get rid of the old one. I'm going to change it to a new one. And now we can say previous key ref.current equals the new key. And we'll just do that for every single time this use effect is called. And that way we keep track of what the previous key was through the entire lifecycle of this component. And then we set the item to have that key. So now we have a super flexible use local storage state custom hook that will pretty much allow anybody to do anything with local storage that they want to in a way that keeps things synchronized. And as complicated as this is, like I said, maybe if it goes over your head, that's totally cool. Don't worry about it. This will make sense and click later, I promise you. But as complicated as this is, our usage of this has not changed at all, and it doesn't impact the code that's using it in any way, which I think is really awesome. And what's also really cool is if I want to change this from local storage state to regular use state, this is all I've got to do. I'm just going to copy this. We'll comment this out to compare, and I'll say react use state. We'll pass that initial name as our initial value, and boom, we're back to local state that doesn't persist between refreshes. It's exactly like the regular use state that you would expect. And to go from this to something that's stored in local storage with something that's just so straightforward as a user of this custom hook, I just think that's a beautiful thing. So let's go ahead and review really quick. So we've got this use local storage state. Originally, we just took the key and the default value, but now we're taking some additional optional options with serialize and deserialize so that we can put something into local storage using JSON stringify and then pull something out of local storage using JSON parse. We updated our lazy initialization function here so that we can read the value out of local storage. And if there is a value in local storage, then we'll deserialize it by default using JSON parse here. Otherwise, we'll return the default value, and we also added the ability for people to set the default value to a function, which we call, so that they don't have to create that value, whatever it is, if it's computationally expensive to create for every render. We also are maintaining the previous key, so if that key changes between renders, we can remove that item from local storage and then set it to the new key. And then we also have this serialize function so that we can serialize that value into local storage so that we can support things like objects and numbers and booleans and all of those things.